This is BeerSmith episode number 112, and it's late September 2015. CJ Shamas joins me this week to discuss barrel-aged sour beers. A quick plug for my newsletter: enter your name and email in the subscription box on the right side at beersmith.com, and I'll send you an email on homebrewing every single week. Join over 50,000 subscribers who get my beer brewing articles every single week. Thank you to this week's sponsor, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They're now offering a full 6 issues a year, up from 4 at a great discount. They're offering a new discount code now, which gives you 15% off everything they sell, including subscriptions and training. The new code is BeerSmith 2015. I encourage you to check out this great new magazine for homebrewers at beerandbrewing.com and use the offer code BeerSmith 2015 to get your 15% discount today. And also, BeerSmith Mobile. The mobile version of BeerSmith is a perfect companion for desktop brewing software. It includes all the tools you need to create recipes on the go, share them with your friends, and act as a pocket brew timer. Check out BeerSmith Mobile at the beersmith.com/mobile site or on Google Play, iTunes, or the Amazon App Store. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is CJ Shamas. CJ has been homebrewing since 2001. He produces barrel-aged beers, sour beers for the last 7 years through experimentation and utilization of small barrels. CJ and his brother James have been successfully building a small barrel program to produce complex sour beers. CJ, it's great to have you on the show.
Brad, thanks for having me.
So how are you doing today? Enjoying the weather?
Oh, I'm enjoying the weather. I actually have a day off of work today, so I'm locked down here in my my barrel room. You see the cultures behind me, and what's better than talking about sour beers and barrel-aged sour beers?
Outstanding. Well, you've been working on a small barrel program to create unique sour beers. Can you tell us a little bit about the program?
Absolutely. So, the word program really speaks volumes to how we approach the barrels. Essentially, each barrel is a program. In essence, what we try to do is a barrel will have a sequence of beers that will go through to maximize the offerings that the barrel will provide, using essentially 3 grists, but a variety of different barrels and fermentation methods, yeast and bacteria, blending, and fruit. We could produce a wide variety of different sour beers.
So, what are some of the beers that you like to brew?
So essentially, I produce 3 grists. So I like to produce Flemish Reds. I love barrel-aged sour beers. Golden sours are great if you play around with bottled dregs. That may be a great beer to add it to. So it's a Flemish Red, it's a golden sour, and a saison, amongst some others. But those are generally the 3 sour beers that I'm producing.
So where do you get barrels? I know they're usually they're used probably. Where do you get your barrels from?
Getting barrels, I would say, is the easy part of the whole process. Typically, I am getting the spirits barrels. Distilleries are using these barrels, these small barrels. We'll call them between 5 and 15 gallons. They're going to be American oak, and these distilleries are using them one, maybe a few times. So getting your hands on them, they're very accessible. I would start with my local distillery, but you can really find them all over the internet.
So you can order them online as well. Obviously, if you have a local distillery, that's a good option. But
yeah, you can. Nothing like having a giant box waiting for you when you get home from work. And the shape of them. Sometimes we've had them delivered where essentially it's just this giant barrel, and they put kind of cardboard on the ends. So if you tell your wife, it's a Christmas gift, don't open it up, she's certainly going to know it's a barrel upon delivery.
What size barrels are you working with?
So the 5 to 15 is typically what you're going to get. I would avoid
5 to 15 gallons, or
5 to 15 gallons, absolutely. You know, the 1 liter, 2 liter, the really small ones with the spigots, their staves are going to be really, really thin. I would kind of steer clear of those. I have a 3 gallon that's really well built that I utilize. I also have an 8 gallon. If you're new to it, how I would approach it is essentially if you're producing 5 gallons on your stovetop or 10 gallons outside, kind of stick within that range. Um, Make it a 1-to-1 kind of situation. So if you're doing 5 on your stove, a 5 gallon barrel is great. I actually like having a couple barrels that are, I would say, the off size, because I'm into blending, and it's very easy for me to blend in and out.
So you're not using like a 36-gallon barrel or anything like that, huh?
Yeah, you know, the big barrels, the 55 and 60s. It's a lot of beer to produce. It just brings up some obstacles to overcome. Like, how do you make that much beer? And then when it's all done, how are you bottling? How are you kegging 55 or 60 at a time? Excuse me. If you're part of a club, it's a great option. But even things, you know, think about it. When after it's done, you got to transfer it out. How do you move that kind of weight? So I'm sticking really with the small barrels at this time.
So tell us a little more about your approach where you try and manage the barrel over its lifetime to get as much utilization out of it as you can.
So these are pretty much just guidelines. I would say the biggest thing that you want to do is let flavor be the catalyst for not only your sequence, but potentially your blending, your finished product. So let flavor dictate everything. So what we talk about today, that's kind of the umbrella thing, is let flavor dictate. What I'm talking about is essentially guidelines. And we'll start with the idea that for each subsequent beer that you put through a barrel, you're certainly going to extract some spirit, but the amount that you'll extract will reduce with each subsequent batch. So if we think about it, the first batch, you're going to get the most amount of spirit. You have to anticipate that.
So when you say spirit, you talk about the leftover alcohol that's infused in the oak or what?
Yeah, exactly. You know, wood is like a sponge, so it's going to absorb that bourbon or that whiskey or that rum. And I find that you really never get rid of that, but it can be a benefit to you as well when done correctly. And that's sort of the theory behind our approach is we're trying to maximize the aging at each step, at each point in a barrel's life.
So do you schedule your batches particularly around that concept, I guess?
Well, everything gets scheduled around, you know, what's in the barrel, what's going to go next. But taste is that umbrella thing. It's that umbrella catalyst. So, you know, your flavors are really going to dictate when it's done in the barrel and when the next batch is going to go in. I certainly would never leave a barrel dry. So anytime a beer is coming out of the barrel, a beer is certainly going in. Just in terms of the spirit barrels, I basically approach the bourbon and the whiskey barrels with a similar treatment. I have a rum barrel that actually gets a different treatment.
Interesting. What kind of barrels are you working with? You mentioned whiskey, bourbon, rum. Are they all made of a particular material, though?
Yeah, they're all American oak. The bourbon and the whiskeys, I think I have a wheat whiskey, a rye whiskey, I have a bourbon, and I have a rum. So in total, I have about 10 barrels that they're either my barrels that I utilize. My brother has his own program with his barrels, and then we collaborate with a couple barrels themselves. The whiskey and the bourbon barrels are going to typically be a heavy char, and produce similar types of flavors within your beer. So I very much approach them the same. The rum barrel is sort of a lighter char. Even the wood, it's American oak, but boy, when I look at the wood, it even looks lighter. And so I approach it with kind of a different treatment in that I'm able to produce some lighter beers through it.
So when you say char, you mean the inside of the barrel is charred, I guess? Yeah.
Yeah, it's exactly right. I mean, if you stick a flashlight in there and you look at a couple of my whiskey or bourbon barrels, I mean, it's just jet black. And the rum barrel, it isn't. You can really see the wood grain and the color of the wood. It looks like it's been onced over. That's it with a flame, but not really charred heavy.
Have you tried playing with any other types of wood?
I have not. Not that I wouldn't, but this is just as a home brewer. This is what's available to me. I can get my hands on these 5 to 15 gallon American oak used spirit barrels very easily. So that's kind of the route I've gone.
Okay, so let's walk through an example. Let's say you got a new whiskey barrel in. What are the types of brews that you might schedule into it?
So I'm pretty much going to start with a non-sour beer. Then I'm going to move to like a Flemish red style, something big, robust, very acidic, very sour. And then slowly but surely, I would move to more of what I would call a golden sour. Now, the reason why I start with a non-sour at first is, remember, that first beer that you put through is going to really produce a lot of spirit flavor. And it's my feeling that that spirit flavor actually plays really well into a imperial stout, into a barley wine, something that's going to be big and roasted and malt driven. My first sour beer through, being that I like the Flemish red style in particular, would also have that malt character. It's not going to be burnt. You don't want it roasted in flavor. That will sort of clash with the sourness. But it's going to have a malt character to it. It's going to be dark. It's going to be big. It's going to be sour, very acidic. It's going to, Flemish Reds will almost have like a vinegar tone. And I think that plays nicely into the flavor that you get from the spirit, because you still will get a certain level of spirit that has to sort of be dealt with. At each subsequent batch, you're going to get a reduction of the amount of spirit in your beer. So, and you can really repeat these steps, or you can stay on one. So, meaning you can put a couple clean beers through it, or you can put a couple clean beers through it and then do Flemish Reds, and that's what you're using with your barrel, or a couple Flemish Reds. But so we'll just say, step one is clean, big and clean, imperial stout, barley wine. Step two is going to be a big sour like a Flemish Red. And then step three is you're in this golden sour. Now, the tricky part with the golden sour is you still want to keep acidity really high at this point, because you're going to still get that residual spirit flavor. And if you don't keep your acidity high, the perception of the wood in the spirit will actually increase.
Interesting.
So at this step, I'm still keeping the acidity high. I would also suggest that if it's not high enough, you can employ a couple different tactics. One is you can blend up the sourness and or do a fruit addition. So post barrel, fruit addition, and the added flavors you get from fruit will kind of help to coincide with that extra spirit or bourbon character. I'm sorry, wood character. Again, every subsequent batch, you're going to get less of that spirit flavor. So at some point, you're going to be able to tone back the acidity. So we'll call that step 4. So step 4 is now I'm producing a golden sour with less acidity and maybe not the need to do a secondary fermentation with fruit.
Interesting. Well, walk us through an example. Let's say something like a Flanders Red. How would you develop a recipe for that?
So typically my Flanders Red Recipe, we'll talk about the grist, 50% Pilsner, 30% dark Munich, 18% of your Caras and your crystals, and a couple percentages of aromatic. I always like to mash warm on any sour beer that I'm producing. And so I would be mashing at about 155 to 158. I'm trying to produce more dextrins, more complex sugars for the bugs to eat. I would also use old hops, only a 60-minute addition. Keep your IBUs very much in check. I want to say around no more than maybe 15, certainly not 20. Keep them low, a 60-minute addition, old hops.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, how most importantly, how do you ferment it out?
So you can ferment this style a couple different ways. You can do a mixed culture, mixed culture in the primary, or you could do it in the secondary where you use Saccharomyces primary. That's kind of it's really up to you. I would say somebody that's just getting into this may not have fermentation equipment that is solely used for making sour beer. So you might want to do the Sacro first. And
we
then
might want to talk about that for just a minute. Talk about some of the sanitation concerns you have working with sour bugs.
Yeah, so anything that touches any sour beer that's going to touch plastic or rubber, not stainless,
or wood, obviously.
Yeah, or wood. There you go. Glass. I even have glass separated, although I think that's probably overkill. But anything permeable, you really need to dedicate to sour. This is it. It's sour. Come up with your own system to kind of differentiate the two between your clean beers and your sour beers.
So, so you keep those two separate. Now, again, can you walk us through the schedule for adding the bugs?
Yeah, so we're talking Flemish Reds right now. So one strategy is mixed culture, primary fermentation. The Yeast Roselaire blend is an outstanding choice for this particular style. And then when you transfer it directly into your oak barrel. The other strategy is to use something like an English ale yeast for primary. And then when you transfer it into your oak barrel, add a dose of that mixed culture, i.e. Roselaire blend.
And then how long do you age it out? What's your typical temperatures? How long do you keep it going?
So temperatures, I'm lucky, Northeast. I have a basement. It's a bit temperature controlled. So, you got to watch that it's not getting extremely warm or really, really cold. I like that basically ale temperatures, fermentation temperatures. So in the 60s, I know I get up sort of mid 70s. The wood kind of takes in and gives back a little bit. I like going through the seasons with it. Depending on the size of the barrel is one factor for determining how long it'll stay in the barrel for. The barrels that we're discussing right now, figure 6 months to 9 months. You don't need to age these things for 5 years or 2 years in a barrel. That's going to be overkill, and you're probably going to produce some off flavors.
So, but it's still 6 to 9 months is a good long time, but it does take time to brew a good sour beer, right?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I would sample them and just understand what the flavors, how the flavors are developing. You can, the tricky part as a home brewer is taking samples in these barrels. You can employ the Vidi method, so you're not breaking the pellicle, so you're drilling a hole in the side of the barrel and putting a stainless steel nail through. You pull the nail. You put your glass, you put the nail back in, or put a sanitized nail back in. That's obviously stainless. I don't do that. I want to do that. I have 2 Bengal cats, and I know they would pull the nail. So instead, I kind of take a little wine thief, and I'll pop the bung. I'll take my sample. But really, you have to be patient. If you're trying to take samples, every week or every few weeks, you're doing yourself a disservice. You don't need to do it. Just put it in and kind of forget about it. I used to even employ a top-off method where I'd keep the barrels as full as possible all the time, and I've really gotten away from that. So I'll put it in a barrel, and I really won't take a sample. I would say for about 3 months, 4 months, and then I will take a sample. And really what I'm looking for is acidity level. Are there any off flavors? How is it developing? And hopefully, I only have to do a couple samples before I say, okay, I know what I'm really going to do with this beer. I know what the blend recipe would have to look like. And certainly we can talk about blending later. But for the most part, if you kind of just put it in the barrel and forget about it for months, you'll do yourself well.
Okay, so let's talk about doing a more complicated version like a golden sour. Those are take a little more time. Walk us through how you might brew one of those.
So with my golden sours, I typically am using sort of a lambic grist. So 60% Pilsner, 40% wheat, aged hops, 60-minute addition only, keep the IBUs very, very low. These typically are going to do really well in a seasoned spirits barrel, particularly a seasoned bourbon or whiskey barrel, my experience, or even a rum barrel. this is the kind of style, as we talked about, where if there's not enough acidity or the barrel is not seasoned enough, the perception of the spirit and the wood is going to overpower. This would be a great choice to add bottle dregs to. So if that's your thing about adding bottle dregs to a beer, I would recommend doing it in sort of a golden sour.
So when you say adding bottle dregs, tell people what you mean by that.
So bottle dregs on the bottom of some bottles that are not pasteurized, some sour beer bottles, there's going to be bacteria that kind of lives through, and it might be in a dormant state. And essentially, what you do is you do a step up.
A starter, right? Starter.
Thank you. I forgot the word. Step up starter. Start with a little bit of food for it and just slowly build it up. What I would do is I would sort of sample that as it went through each step and kind of taste what it's like. That's the idea with the bottle dregs. I've employed that method with sort of inconsistent results. And what I've done in my own brewery is I've used a few bottle dregs. I've built up a starter. I've liked what it's produced in terms of its flavors. I utilized it with success. And now that's sort of my house culture derived from bottle dregs rather than a situation that everybody's in the pool.
But of course, you have to pick a beer that's not pasteurized, right, to use, which
Yep,
a lot of them are. So that's a challenge at times.
It is. Mike Tonsmeyer has an amazing blog, and he has a long list of bottles that have bottle dregs that you can harvest and are somewhat reliable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then, so what's the blend of yeast you'd recommend if you're not using that method, though?
So, if you can see behind me, those that are on video here, I have a number of different cultures that I utilize, and it's sort of fun playing with the cultures. I would definitely use a clean a Saccharomyces that's healthy. Anytime you're doing a mixed culture, you want to make sure that there is some level of Saccharomyces so that the primary fermentation is a success. In my own brewery, I've taken Roselaire, Weiss Roselaire blend, and after some uses of it, after building it up, I've kind of recognized that the Saccharomyces is a bit spent, and I've kind of added my own house Saccharomyces to it. I have a Saison blend that I've added to it. And then I maintain a couple different cultures of Brettanomyces that I've added to it. So I've kind of have this house sour Saccharomyces, Lactobacillus, or some Pediococcus in it.
So you're primarily using the Brett to do the souring, though, or are you relying on other ones as well?
No, I'm basically never relying on Brett to sour. I use Brett often, but I'm really relying on primarily Lactobacillus and Pediococcus to do most of my souring. I'm relying on, in these mixed fermentations, I'm relying on Saccharomyces to do the heavy lifting. And then the long-term aging for the Brettanomyces to clean up any off flavors, to kind of round out the overall flavor in it.
Now, we had Michael Dossett on a few weeks back, a few episodes back, and he was talking about making sour beers. And he had an interesting approach where he was using Lactobacillus in the primary, before the primary fermentation, to sour the beer actually first. And then he would actually boil it and then add regular yeast in order to finish the fermentation out. What do you think of that?
I have not done that particular approach, but I have done Lactobacillus in the primary for 4 to 8 hours in the absence of Saccharomyces. I've done
that's what he was doing basically. He was using the Lactobacillus first. Yeah.
Right, but I just haven't boiled it. You would do that if you want to keep your equipment clean. That's the advantage of that particular technique. So now you essentially kill the Lactobacillus, but you have a certain level of acidity already baked into the beer, so to speak. What I have done is sort of like the Dr. Lambic approach, where it's a 3-step fermentation. So the first 48 hours are the Lactobacillus. I do it warm. You get your sourness. Then you add the Saccharomyces. Give it 5-6 days, like a normal primary fermentation, and then transfer it onto Brett. So I have done that. It's not my my best work, I would say. It's kind of what I'm experimenting with, and I've yet to do that where I'm actually introducing it into a barrel. Most of the sour beers that I'm making are really soured either in the barrel or they're aged in the barrel.
Makes sense. Yeah. So you're trying to get that contact time. I know he was doing some simpler ones. He was doing, I think it was a Berliner Weiss.
Exactly.
Which you can do relatively rapidly using that technique. I just thought it was an interesting technique.
I would say that that's probably the best technique specifically for a Berliner Weiss. I just find that the barrel aged sours have a level of complexity that the non-barrel aged sours just don't have. Another advantage of that method is that you can sour really, really quickly. So you can put out a sour beer basically you're making sour in 2 days. But I would suggest that when you actually age it out, it's going to take you more like a month or two for the finished product.
Right. Well, finish out your golden ale we were talking about here. How would you continue fermenting it?
So the golden ale, I would definitely ferment that in, as I said, a seasoned bourbon or a rum barrel. And I love adding fruit to a beer. This is a great candidate for fruit. And when I would do that, it would be post barrel. So coming out of the barrel in a carboy with some fruit. You have some fruit options that you can really utilize. One is concentrate, or these are the two that I utilize the most. It's really fresh stone fruits or concentrates. And anytime, in particular when I'm using concentrate, anytime I'm doing a secondary fermentation with fruit, I'm adding a fresh culture or I'm adding Brett to it. With the concentrates, I find that a lot of bang for your buck, a lot of flavor, but there's a couple obstacles that you kind of sort of need to overcome. One of them is the secondary fermentation can be a little sluggish, or it can actually be a lot sluggish. So adding some Brett, adding some fresh culture, when you do that, will kind of speed up and get the secondary fermentation jump started. So you're not sitting on that thing for 6 months or another year.
So you mentioned you're doing this post barrel though. So you're pulling it out of the barrel after some number of months, right? And
correct.
Then starting another fermentation up with the fruit, I guess, right?
That's exactly what we're doing. And you're able to get another level of complexity and flavor there. With the fresh fruit, I still like to add the Brettanomyces at that point, or fresh culture. I don't find it as essential as the concentrate, but I still do employ that. Prior to putting it into my carboy, these pieces of fresh fruit, what I suggest people do, this is what I've done with great success, is I like to find on sale, in season stone fruits. I buy them, I ripen them, almost over ripen, to the point where, if it's like a peach, you almost need to bathe after you eat it. So I would quarter it, and then I vacuum seal them, and then I freeze them. Prior to using them, I'll thaw them out. You definitely want to have them thawed before you put your sour beer on. With the concentrate, there's some great advantages. Storage, a lot of bang for your buck. We already talked about one of the downsides in the secondary fermentation being stalled out and the need to add a fresh culture. And the other thing that I do find is in this style of like this golden sour that I'm referring to, the color sometimes of these concentrates are a little dull as compared to the vibrant color that you get from fresh fruit. So what I would do is, and I would suggest, is adding a little bit of fresh fruit in conjunction with the concentrate. So if you're doing a tart cherry concentrate, you might want to throw some, store-bought cherries in there just to kind of make that color little less brown, little more deep red. I've even done hibiscus tea, made a really diluted hibiscus tea with my tart cherry concentrate, so that the final product wasn't kind of this brown color, but instead this very vibrant red.
Now, I know some fruits come through much better in beer than others. For example, raspberries, apricots typically come through really good. Apricots taste like peaches, actually. But What fruits have you found work best with your sour beers?
So I love the stone fruit. Um, I came across some pluots, and if you've never had a pluot, it's actually a cross between a plum and an apricot. And I guess there's like 20 some odd varieties of it. I happen to be in Arthur Ave with my wife, and there's a little old market in there that we were picking up some groceries and just kind of having a great day. And the gentleman kind of force fed me this pluot. And it just like kind of blew my mind. It was very ripe. It was overripe. And he was trying to unload them. So after some negotiation, I walked out with about 25 pounds of pluot. In this particular pluot, they call it Dragon Tier, and for like $10. So I've been making pluot beers for a couple years now.
Well, apricots and plums are ones that do come through pretty strong in flavor, if I recall. So that's a good option. Have you tried some others, though?
Yeah, I live in a condo complex, and it's near the water, so we do a lot of fishing and late night fishing. And one day we're walking back, and I'm smelling like fruit, almost fermented fruit. And come to find out, I never really noticed it. There's this big crabapple tree kind of on our grounds. And it was just covered in yeast, and it was late fall, northeast. The leaves were kind of falling at that point, and so I came back the next day and I harvested a bunch of these crab apples. It worked for secondary fermentation, but apparently there's just not a whole lot of sugars in the crab apple, so I wouldn't say that I really got a great fruit forward beer out of that. Other fruits that I really like, I really like peaches. Peaches are really inexpensive. What I did this season is they went on sale for probably 6 weeks, and you get them 50 cents a pound, 75 cents a pound. So I would buy 5 to 10 pounds at a time, and I'd leave them out. I would get them as ripe as I could, and if I didn't think they were really outstanding, we just kind of ate them. And it was just like fruit we had for fruit salad and whatnot. There was a couple weeks there where they were mind blowing, and those are the ones that I quartered. I even kept the pit in them, and I vacuum seal them. And certainly on my list of beers is going to be some kind of peach sour.
Nice. Yeah, peaches aren't bad. They tend to fade just a little bit in fermentation. The interesting thing is I think apricots, if you use apricots, you actually get a peach flavor out of it. That's a good option, though. I wanted to ask about blending next. Sour beers often require some blending at the end. What's been your experience with blending?
So my experience with blending is many times, you're thinking of it in terms of blending up and down acidity. Potentially, when you're dealing with these spirit barrels, you're blending down the oak or the essence of the spirit. I work a lot with my rum barrel and saisons. In that regard, I'm actually trying to sometimes blend up the yeast-driven flavors. What I employ is I have a bunch of these 1-gallon jugs, and I have everything from clean blending beers to very acidic blending beers to Brett beers to blend in to non-oak versions of sour beers to blend in. I would suggest to people a really great method is to blend post-barrel in a carboy. If nothing else, your advantages versus your disadvantages are probably your highest by doing that. One of the big advantages is when you blend in, it gives the beer an opportunity to kind of totally finish it out, so you're not overcarbonating a beer.
Well, excellent. Do you have any other advice on blending?
Yeah, I like blending at bottling, but you really need to be careful, particularly if you're blending in like a clean beer. I've had some success, however, with blending with saison yeast. So the Bell French saison yeast is one that, boy, that thing ferments down really, really low. I've got it down all the way to 1.00. I've heard people getting even lower than that. And that may be a great option to blend in. If you really want to do a clean beer at bottling. You just have to be very careful if you do that, because if there's Brett in your sour beer, it could break down some of those more complex carbohydrates that the Saccharomyces doesn't break down. Therefore, you could overcarbonate a beer, you could produce a bottle bomb. So just be very careful. If you were to employ that method that I have done with success, what I would do is the clean beer that you're blending with, make sure it's at least in a secondary. It's all the yeast is dropped out. You've checked the gravity. The gravity is low as you possibly can get it. Blend in only a small portion into the final beer. Maybe even scale back the priming sugars that you're utilizing, just to ensure that you're not producing a bottle bomb. Maybe even only bottle a couple bottles, and until you really understand what your microbes are doing with that blend.
You've run into a number of challenges in barrel aging your sour beers. What are some of the challenges you've had?
Well, there's a fair amount of challenges. For beginners, it's going to be space. It's going to be coming up with your program. It's going to be how are you actually putting them in a container. If you're doing bottles, boy, you're dealing with a lot of bottles. Once you kind of get your feet under you a little bit, we're to the point now where 10 barrels, producing a fair amount of these sour barrel-aged beers, that I really have had one big obstacle to overcome, and another obstacle that I'm still sort of dealing with. And one of the obstacles that I feel like I've put in my rearview mirror is having diacetyl present in the final product. And for those that have never tasted diacetyl, the flavors from diacetyl, it's essentially like movie popcorn. The smell of movie popcorn, that's the taste.
Yeah, like a buttery kind of.
Exactly. And I'm very adverse to that flavor at this point. So there's some things that I've done to, I want to say eradicate, but sort of put it in my rearview mirror. One of them is I'm using Brettanomyces more than ever. And Brett will actually consume that diacetyl over time. So I am doing that. And the other thing is at one point I was doing a lot of bottle dreg stuff. And it was almost like, we do a bottle share night, and I would just, everybody in the pool kind of thing, whether it's going directly into fermentation, into a beer that's fermenting, or right into an Erlenmeyer, and, build it up but don't taste it. And I've kind of curved that back a little bit. And like I had said, I now have a house culture derived from bottle dregs that I know is not producing diacetyl. I know my results. I know what it's capable of doing. And the other thing is with diacetyl is time is your friend. So now I have, I'm embarrassed to say how many sour beers I have in my closet that are bottled. So I just will avoid that. But I'm to the point now where when I bottle a sour beer, it's really going to the back of the closet. I'm only sampling it to identify how it's aging and that it's stable in the bottle. And once it's stable, I'm sort of forgetting about it for a while. So time is your friend. The obstacle the challenge I'm still sort of dealing with is getting a pellicle in the bottle. It's inconsistent, but it's reoccurring. So here's what I've done of late. And I want to say it's helped, but I have not necessarily totally overcome the pellicle.
So one thing pellicle, is, you mean, tell folks just in case they're not familiar.
A pellicle is basically produced, my understanding, by Brettanomyces. And what it does is it's on the surface of a sour beer, and it protects the beer from oxygen. So you will see, if you're producing sour beers, you're going to see pellicles in your carboys. It'll be in your barrel if you pop your bung and you look in. And that's a good thing. It's essentially the beer protecting itself, or the Brettanomyces protecting the beer. You don't really want it in the bottle. It's not going to produce any off flavors, but it just doesn't look nice. So you spend all this time and energy producing a beautiful sour beer, and now you're presenting it, and there's a bit of a slime or surface to it. So you want to get rid of that thing. It's a flaw in my mind. So here's
Makes
what
sense.
I've done. And again, my results are better, but it's not, as I said, in my rearview mirror. So one thing I've done is I no longer use a bottling bucket for bottling sours. I bought my second Blickman beer gun, and now I'm bottling out of a keg using the Blickman beer gun. So what I'll
Mhm.
do is when the beer is finished, it goes into a keg that's full of CO2. I do all my priming sugar would be in there. Any blend are all going to be in there. I'm using a Blickman beer gun. Now what I'm going to do is in a sanitized bottle, I'm going to fill the bottle with CO2. The Blickman beer gun allows you to do that.
Yeah, it's a
I fill
counter pressure filler, basically, right?
It basically is. I then fill the bottle, and then the little space on the top, that little space, air space, I then
Okay.
just hit it with a little more CO2 and immediately put a cap on it and cap it. And I will do one bottle at a time that way. So I'm getting as much CO2 in there as I possibly
Mhm.
can. And in addition, the caps that I'm using are oxygen eating caps. I don't know how good they are. Yeah, I feel like this has helped. But I still kind of deal with this as a bit of an issue.
You still get just a little bit of slime on the top, huh?
I do. It's again, it's very inconsistent. It's sometimes just flakes. It's not, flat across. So I'm still dealing with it.
Well, where can folks learn more about brewing with barrels or brewing sour beers? What would you recommend?
There's a bunch of different sources out there. One thing that I've done, honestly, Brad, is in the last year or so, shows like yours, they're so informative. Now I'm driving in the car, I'm listening to a podcast. My wife thinks I'm crazy because I'll work out, I'll run to these different podcasts. And they're really so informative, and people that are producing these beers just want to share what they know, sort of like what I'm doing right now. I mean, I'm gaining nothing by talking to you about this. I just love talking about it.
Yeah, I think it's great. We're able to do these kinds of things. I'm at 100 and something. It's 113, I think this is. So it's been a lot of fun doing this, doing the show for all this time. It's been it's 4 years now, over 4 years, I think we've been doing it.
That's awesome. Congratulations.
Yeah, a lot of fun. And you can go, I'll just put a plug in real quick. You can go to beersmith.com/radio, and I actually have all the episodes rotating 24 hours a day. And so you can listen to that on your mobile and so on. I actually wanted to ask you if there's anything else you wanted to add.
Besides, we've talked about a bunch of different topics. As your program develops and you get more barrels and you do more blending, what's going to happen is you're going to be drinking beers that you brewed or you blended years ago. And you're going to want to know exactly the treatment for that beer so you can really learn from it and learn what worked and learn how to make some adjustments. And in order to do that, you have to keep great records. I use your program. I use BeerSmith, but I also carry a notebook, a journal of my brew day. Every barrel, I have a whiteboard with every barrel that I have in my program, and essentially what is the treatment of that barrel. Any blends, any carboys, there's a 3x5 card there with kind of the notes of that beer. Any aspect of my records has batch numbers on them. So when they're blends, even on my caps, to say batch number 209, 214, 217. When you're looking at that, you're saying, okay, what does this really mean? But when I go back to my journal or I go to BeerSmith, boy, I can tell you exactly what the script of each of those beers were.
Very cool. Very cool. Great advice. Well, CJ, thank you again for coming on the show. Really appreciate you being here.
Brad, thanks so much for having me. Keep up the great work. It's time to just start making some more sour beers, barrel-aged sour beers.
Well, thank you again to CJ Shamas for appearing this week. CJ's been brewing since 2001, and he specializes in making small barrel-aged beers. Thanks again to CJ Shamas for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, where you get your 15% discount on the magazine or anything in the store if you use the offer code BeerSmith2015 when you shop at beerandbrewing.com. Again, use the offer code BeerSmith2015 and you get your subscription now at beerandbrewing.com. And also BeerSmith Mobile, the perfect brewing app for your iPhone, iPad, Android, or Kindle Fire device. Learn more about BeerSmith Mobile at beersmith.com/mobile or on Google Play, iTunes, or the Kindle App Store. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week.